I'd like to welcome you all to this conference. My name is Nigel Gilbert. I'm a sociologist from the University of Surrey. And I just want to say a few words of introduction. But before I do that, the usual kind of reminder, could you switch your mobile phone off, please? And if there is a fire alarm, it's for real. There are no drills expected, and there are fire exits here and at the back of the room. So, good to see you all here. We're really pleased that you are all here. As always with these things, you never know when you're organising it whether anybody's going to be interested at all. And it turns out that lots of people are. We are, in fact, full today, so glad you could make it. Let me say a little bit about our sponsor. What you're going to be hearing about today is part of a program funded, supported by the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, the EPSRC. And this program consists of 4 big projects. The aim of the program, as it says on the slide, is to develop and apply the tools and techniques of complexity science for tackling major societal research challenges. And it all started in 2009 when EPSRC put out a call for proposals. 4 projects were funded, starting in 2010. And this is a substantial effort, as you can see. There's something like 100 researchers in all have been involved in the 4 projects. We are in the process of training some 20 PhD students, and the whole thing cost about £14 million. It hasn't finished yet, but we're coming towards the end, and so this seemed a good opportunity to collect together what we have done and what we have found and show you. So the 4 projects are listed on the screen. You're going to be hearing more about each of those during this morning. As you can see, the projects are located in 4 different universities over England, and we've brought them all together in today. What we'll be having is, first of all, presentations from each of the projects. And then there will be a lunch and the opportunity to talk over posters, demonstrations, and so on. And then we've got a program for this afternoon as well. The network is a separate project in a way, which is aimed to bring together the 4 projects to make sure that the sum of the 4 projects is more than the parts. To build a community, an academic community, but also a policy community that is involved with the application of complexity science to policy. You'll be able to find more about the network in the folders that you should all have on your seats. And there are some contact details. There is somebody sending tweets about our conference out as I speak, I believe. But there's also an email contact address there. And we have a website. So I hope you will enjoy today's program and learn a bit about complexity science and what that might mean for policy. I'm going to start off by saying a little bit about what this complexity science thing is. I'm going to give just a quite general introduction to the idea of complexity science as applied to social policy, or to policy. And I'm going to talk about complexity in terms of these four themes, or these four bits of jargon, just to give you an idea of the theme that underlies pretty much all the things that you're going to be hearing about today. So I'm going to talk about the fact that society is multi-level. I'm going to talk about the idea of non-linearity. I'm going to show you the idea of emergence, and throughout all of this we will all see lots of things about networks. So, what do I mean by all of these words? Multi-level. Well, the idea here is really quite straightforward, but somewhat or often difficult to apply in particular situations. The idea of multi-level is that society consists of everything from neurons, individuals, crowds or collections of people, through to institutions. And when we are thinking about policy or understanding society, one of the difficulties is that we need to think about all of these levels simultaneously. That what happens at the individual level has an effect at the institutional level, and vice versa. That what happens obviously at the level of institutions, of government, of church, of state, has an effect on individuals. So we have a complicated system where we have what's called both upward causation and downward causation across these different levels. And that's one of the fundamental issues in the idea of complexity science. Then there's non-linearity. What do I mean by that? I guess for many of you, you'll have, in your degree, you probably did some statistics, and you did things like regression and statistical techniques like this. But even if you didn't, the idea of linearity is straightforward. The idea is that something is affected by a number of other things, and the amount that that thing is affected by depends on the changes in those other variables, those other things. And in particular, that a small change in one of the factors is likely to end up with a small change in the dependent variable, the effect. A big change will have big effects. Now, this is what I and others teach our undergraduates about. Unfortunately, it's not a very good reflection of the real world. In the real world, the opposite is often the case, that small changes have huge effects. Big changes may or may not have big effects. And it's that I'm getting at when I talk about non-linearity. Here's an illustration of non-linearity, and I promise that this is the only mathematical equation that I'm going to be showing you today. This is what's known as the logistic growth equation, and I use this as an example because this is a clear example of a relationship that is non-linear. In fact, it grows like an S shape, as in the graph. This particular equation comes essentially from ecology, but it applies quite well to things that are more social. For example, if you plot the diffusion or the spread of mobile phones from when they were kind of those brick things to the state where we are at the moment, when there are more mobile phones in the UK than there are people in the UK, then the shape of that growth curve looks like this S shape that I've got there. And indeed we can build a simple little model of such diffusion. It goes like this, and as it spreads, that kind of spread applies to all sorts of innovations, to the spread of rumours and gossip, to the spread of mobile phones, to the spread of things like whether one smokes or not. So in many circumstances in society we have to deal with non-linearity rather than nice simple linear relationships. Here's another aspect where what we see appears to be more complicated or more complex than might at first appear. Let's imagine that we have a couple of people, we'll call them technically nodes in a network, but you could think of them as people who know each other, who are friends. We say that they're connected with an edge, and there you can see in the middle of the black square there are two people, little red dots, and they're linked together by, let's say, friendship. Now let's add some more people to this world, and we're going to do that, and at the same time we're also going to get these people to get to know each other. We're going to put more links in our world. And we're going to do that using a special sort of rule. That rule says that when new people are introduced or new nodes are introduced, we create links or friendships, not just at random, but preferentially such that the popular people, the popular nodes, are more likely to have a link to them. And we get this rather pretty looking pattern. You can see there, you can see it growing. The size of the dots indicates the number of links each of those nodes have. And there's something kind of interesting if we plot what's going on here. If you look at the top graph, the one that's called degree distribution, you'll see that most people have just one link. They only know one person in our diagram. There were a few, the big red dots, a couple here, who have lots of friends. Remember the rule that we're using to make the links. So it's a very non-linear relationship. It's a very non-linear curve we've got there. Intriguingly, however, if we take the logarithm of both of those axes, you end up with the bottom graph, and as you can see, the points on that graph more or less follow a straight line. This is an example, a simple example of what's known as a power law, and again, it's a characteristic of many relationships, many features of actual societies. I've talked so far about nodes and links and friendships and people, but let's have a look at a few more realistic examples. So power laws in general are often found where we have a few exceptionally popular items, the big red blobs in my previous picture, some averagely popular items, but the majority of the items, whatever they may be, are relatively unnoticed or unpopular. So, some examples. About 50% of scientific papers that are published are never referred to and never cited by anybody. This is very sad for us academics. If you look at the revenues of Hollywood movies, there's a few blockbusters, and most of them go straight to DVD. If you look at websites, well, Google gets an incredible number, and my homepage gets very few. Phone calls received per day, even the size of firms, the number of employees of different firms, they're all related in this power law kind of way. So that's another aspect of complexity. Here's a third or a fourth. You may recognize this. It's not actually the M25, but it could be. What's happening here is that a bunch of car drivers have been told just to follow the car in front. And you see what's happening? Even though there are no traffic lights, no traffic accidents, there are traffic jams. And this is an instance, a nice example of what we call emergence. Here we have individual cars and their drivers who are following a simple rule, just follow the car in front. But what emerges from their actions is a traffic jam. Think back to in a moment what I've just been saying a moment or two ago about multi-level. Here we have one level, which is the individual car driver. And we have a superior level, which is the whole assembly of cars going round and round in a circle. And we have a characteristic of the whole thing, that is a traffic jam, which only makes sense at that superior level. You can't talk about a traffic jam of a single car. You can talk about a traffic jam on the M25. And that's also a theme in complexity science, that what we're interested in is the individual actions and also the way in which those individual actions yield, through emergence, complex behaviour at the level of the society, of the organisation, of the institution, or whatever. And one of the ways in which we can come to understand and comprehend that kind of emergence, and indeed all sorts of complexity, is to build a model of it. And here is a simple model of exactly what we were seeing before. We've actually got two lanes of cars rather than one. But if you look, you'll see that we're getting a traffic jam just as before. And we can adjust with this model. It's a nice thing about models, is we can adjust various parameters and see what effects those parameters have on the behaviour of the traffic jam. Incidentally, notice that the cars are going in a clockwise direction, but the traffic jam is moving anti-clockwise. And if you get a helicopter and fly over the M25, you'll see that is exactly what happens there too. The traffic jam, as it were, goes backwards as compared with the direction of the traffic. Okay, so I've talked then about a few of the characteristic features of complexity, and I've illustrated those with respect to social phenomena. Complexity is an idea that has permeated the whole of the sciences, so that there are many people working on the complexity of physical phenomena, of biological, ecological, environmental phenomena. But what we're going to be talking about today is the relevance of complexities to social phenomena, in particular social policy. So just to summarize, the way we're thinking about things is that society and its components can be described as a complex system, a complex adaptive system, because there are many units in it, whether people, of course, and organisations, with links between them, of many different kinds, that the interactions between those units are important, there are feedback mechanisms, and that from all of that we get nonlinearity, emergence, the idea of multi-level institutions. In these few remarks, I've only begun to scratch the surface of what complexity science is all about. There's a great deal more that you'll be hearing about during this morning and indeed in the afternoon. But I hope what I have done is got you curious as to what these kinds of ideas can do when you are looking at policy and society. So I'm now going to hand over to a colleague from one of the other of the four projects. Professor Alan Wilson will be coming to talk about the ENFOLDing project. Thanks. All over to you, Alan.
Thank you. Good. Well, thank you, Nigel, for that for that introduction, which produces a context for the rest of us. What I'm going to talk about is the ENFOLDing project, which is about global dynamics. This is a conference about policy, so I'm going to talk about the different elements of this and of this project and how it relates to a range of policy issues. I'm going to talk about it for 20 minutes or thereabouts, and hopefully leave time for a few questions. Because it's me who's doing all the talking, I need to make it clear at the start that it's the work of quite a large team, and the current members of the team are listed on this slide. But onto the project itself. We have four main work streams. We're concerned with trade, with migration, with security and development aid. And as with all modelling tasks and indeed policy tasks in complexity science, we're very concerned with the interdependence of these different elements. And so the integration is a very important part of what we try to do. It's obviously an incredibly ambitious project. Very grateful to EPSRC for taking the risk of funding something as ambitious as this. In a policy context, we then finish up saying, we're not a big government department with lots of resources. We're a small team, project by project, within this programme. And so we'd like to think that what we're doing is working on a proof of concept basis that others will pick up. But in some cases, as you'll see, we do have quite specific results. So we're going to try and integrate this. I then have a slide which I'm almost tempted to talk about before I show you. I experimented earlier today at the back of the room, and you have to be in the front third of the room to be able to read it. So I'm just going to talk around the structure of it, and there are a lot of words on it. But essentially what that shows, the right-hand side that says world is actually the trade part of the model. And then you'll see the ones you can read, migration, development aid and security, coming round anti-clockwise, are the elements of the project. What we're actually saying in terms of integration is that what dominates, or one way of looking at the success of countries is their economic success. And a standard way of looking at economic accounts, success in imports, exports, which generates the trade, balance of payments, is to build national input-output models. It's at this point when you start to see the serious ambition of our project. We're working on a country basis. A number of countries changes slightly from almost month to month these days, but there's something like 223 at the present time. So we're actually trying to build a 223 zone model, at the heart of which is an input-output model for each of these countries. It turns out from other projects that we can build on that we actually have good input-output accounts for about 40 countries. And my colleagues, Rob and Thomas in particular, have developed a means of extrapolating the intelligence and using other data to build input-output models for the rest. And then we have to join them. So the core of this project, go back to saying seriously ambitious, is in effect to build a world input-output model of 200-odd countries and to build the trade models that go with it, and then to link it to the interaction models of migration, security, and development aid. So that's what we're trying to do. The interdependencies are obvious at the end of the day. Security issues will drive migration. That will cause needs for development aid in different kinds of countries and so on. So what I'm going to do is just talk very briefly about each of the projects and the component projects and the potential users. So let me kick off with trade. And I have to say, much of this was new to me in terms of what would in the jargon would be domain knowledge. But we've learned a lot about trade. We've focused mainly on containers, and you see the force of the container traffic in terms of manufacturing from China has generated new trade routes, bigger ships and so on. You get to a point where the ships are now too big in a number of cases to get through to the Suez Canal, to get into many of the ports. So we now have new routes, new ports, and we have to take account of all that, building it into what we call the multi-layer model. So containers, what's changing in the system? To build the model in this case, you actually have to look at the operators. The small print on the bottom there basically says there are 65 carriers known to us at the moment, and over 600 different shipping services, and that's one of the kind of networks that Nigel was talking about. And the nodes of that network are the ports, the 400-odd ports and 200-odd port operators. And so we're trying to relate trade to the shipping system at that kind of scale. What we've then learned is that as the ships get bigger, that it's harder for the operators to cover the range of routes that they would ideally like. So they start cooperating with each other in new ways, and that gives us another kind of modelling problem. We've shifted scales from time to time. We've done the global overviews. But in this case, it's an example of where we've looked at the attractiveness of ports in Africa. And this is interesting in a policy context because, and it connects to development aid. One of the issues with African countries and their exports is the ability of the transport infrastructure, including the ports, to effectively get, for example, agricultural products into export markets. And interestingly, in terms of policy applications, this is one example of where for the last 6 months we've been working on a separate project for the World Bank, commissioned by the World Bank, to look at how to improve these flows in one country, which is landlocked. So exports from landlocked countries, in this case Uganda, and at the same time we've shifted, I haven't got a slide for this, to the Pacific in so-called sea-locked countries, and we've been looking at how to improve exports from the small countries in the Pacific Islands rim. So specific policy projects there. In terms of modelling, the so-called multi-layer model, we talked about a sociological layer, it's probably better called a cultural layer. Common languages increases trade relatively, this sort of effect, through to the, obviously the economics. GDP generates trade volumes and the physical networks. And so we have combined that into a working trade model. And of course, the extent to which this does represent the core of a complexity science project, which is to have the model, use it as a kind of what-if, at least short-run forecasting capability, is potentially then of interest to a very wide range of policymakers. And I'm not going to go through these one at a time, but everything from international agencies through to particular shipping lines, companies that actually invest in shipping, their intelligence systems, and so on. And as I'll show you in a minute, it links very directly to security and development aid. So let me move on then to the second work stream, which is migration. This has been much more difficult because the global level of data on migration is very poor. So in the first instance, we've actually focused on European migration between European countries, which is of course perfectly topical in a UK context at the moment. And this reveals another problem of doing this kind of modelling, and that is the data is not available at a sufficiently at the fine spatial scale that you would actually like for policy making. And so in this case, we've developed different kinds of modelling techniques to integrate the data and make best estimates of the flows that are missing. And in the European context, this has allowed us to get down to regions within countries, relatively small regions, so that in the UK, for example, we can now track migrants into more or less local authority areas or groups of local authority areas. And that's allowed us to get into different kinds of policy questions. One of them is mentioned on the next slide. One of them isn't. And incidentally, I'm referring to some of our publications as I go along, and I'm sure we'll make these slides available, so if you want to follow these through, you can. One result we get is to estimate international European flows in the light of GDP per capita at one end and GDP per capita at the other end. And you can actually see the differences generating volumes of migration. And the point we make there is it's very difficult to see how current EU aid policies are going to be, as it were, big enough in terms of their effect to fundamentally change these migration flows. The other thing we've done in policy terms at a finer scale for the UK is to look at European migration from different countries into smaller areas within the UK, and then to correlate those with employment levels. So it actually allows us, in principle, to tackle the issue of the extent to which immigrants are actually, as it were, taking a bigger share of the jobs and all the things that are very politically sensitive. Again, actually rather a difficult thing to do. And Adam Dennett, who's done a lot of the work on this, has published a separate paper on that. And obviously lots of people interested in this kind of migration data. We've now extended it so that at least we've got a global database with, again, best estimates of the data that's missing to go into the integrated model. Third stream is security, and in this case we've worked at three scales. We've worked at the global scale, we've worked at a regional scale, and we've worked at a very local scale in modelling the London riots. The kind of modelling techniques we've used here connects to Nigel's illustration of the Verhulst equation, which in ecology were developed by Locker and Volterra in the 1930s. And it's very interesting, actually, that in ecology and also directly in security through the work of Lewis Fry Richardson has such a long history, and it's been very interesting to build on this in this context. But we do believe that we've actually added something new. In terms of tools for complexity science, the heart of a lot of the kind of modelling that we've been involved with, it's mentioned on this slide, is spatial interaction modelling. And that's nearly always, as in the trade case, models of goods, material flows, or indeed models of person flows, as in migration. How do we translate that into security? We're actually measuring spatial interaction as threat. So what is the flow of threat from one place to another, maybe from one country to another? An example I'm going to show you in a minute, it's actually from pirate motherships to container ships travelling through the Gulf of Aden. And in each case, we can use this idea of threat. What we finish up doing is adding space to Lotka-Volterra models, because for reasons that I've never really understood, ecologists never really added space in the sense that we as geographers work with space and zone systems. And so if you're talking about red armies and blue armies, or red teams and blue teams, it's perfectly obvious intuitively that the spatial distribution of these resources, as in battlefields or war zones or whatever, will have an impact on the real situation. So we've got as far as with these models, where in our latest proof of concept attempt, this is some work that Peter Baudin's been doing, we've actually looked at the disposition of forces around the North Korea-South Korea border as analysed by these models of threat. And again, what seems to be coming out is something that's perfectly plausible. And so what we're currently doing is then trying to extend this modelling of threat to a global scale. There's quite a good data set in principle on, if it's only from defence expenditure or whatever, but obviously more detail of that as to the levels of resources around the system. So that will be part of our global integration model. Now, this slide, it will run as a movie for about 30 seconds, shows you actually the growth of piracy globally over about a 20-year period. And I have to say it was an eye-opener for me, because I assumed piracy was all off Somalia and Gulf of Aden and so on. But as you see, 10 years ago, it was more in the Far East. And as it gets nearer the present time, you'll actually see the area around the Gulf of Aden begins to dominate. So the patterns shift. And what we've done is to move into the Gulf of Aden. That's a time series. And in this case, we've used an agent-based model, another of the techniques that Nigel mentioned in his introduction. And so the agents in this case, there are two lots of agents. There are basically pirates and there are naval vessels that will have, shown by the, as it were, quasi-catchments on this map, areas of potential protection. So we've modelled that as an agent-based model. We've got very good data on this because all the attacks are recorded. And we've got data on the flows of shipping in the area. And the agent-based model works pretty well. A good example of our proof of concept notion in that it has obvious policy applications in a whole for a whole range of government agencies and shipping lines that have a direct interest in this. Fourth area is security. And we were opportunists in relation to this project when the London riots happened in 2011, because we thought we had a complexity science toolkit that in principle we could apply to modelling the London riots. And so we built a three-stage model. The first was decision of residents of an area. We did it as a ward-based model. to participate in a riot, and we used an epidemiological submodel for that. Then you've decided to participate, where do you go? And you go off to retail centres, so we can actually use more or less our standard retail model for that. And then the police response, and we turned out what for me was interesting intelligence, which I'm told is more or less the case, and it's probably what we all saw on television, that the police at a site, on the whole, won't intervene until there are more police present than there are rioters. And this begins to tell you things about how to have a policing strategy for this kind of risk. A lot of queries about relationship to multiple deprivation. So we looked at this from our data, and interestingly, it produces more or less a straight line. So I just offer that as a one-off. But we put those three submodels together to simulate a day of rioting, as it were, or a night of rioting with the police response. And we actually did pretty well. Won't go into any of the results. But what was interesting is this final slide, and again, go back to saying, I have to say proof of concept, but if you believe this for a typical day, we produced an index which is the vertical axis of the severity of rioting against a horizontal axis, which is the number of police that were available in London on that night. And you probably won't remember, but it started on day 1 with 3,000 police, and it ended on day 5 with 16,000 police on the streets. And if you believe this kind of model, if it had started with 6,000 instead of 3,000, then it probably wouldn't have lasted more than one night. So potentially you can get a policy response from this kind of model. And again, there's a reference on the slide to how that model is written up. And when you look at the posters and the demos, there's a live demo that Toby Davis, who's here, who has worked on this, is running. So you can actually go and control the London riots. You can go and be the police, if you like, and attempt to control the London riots using that model. Development aid has been a bit harder. We started later. The data is extremely difficult to assemble, very fragmented. There are even definitional problems. But we've got to the point now where we have a database. We have an idea of where of donor countries for different kinds and recipient countries, and ultimately our objective is to relate that to our core input-output models. It's quite interesting. In fact, I should have produced this slide. We actually did a list of countries where you looked at the percentage of GDP that came from development aid. And there are countries where it's as high as 35%. Typically, of course, very small, poor countries, Pacific Island countries and so on. But quite significant percentages in some African countries. And again, if we can make more progress with this, a lot of obvious policy interests. So, final challenge. We've done a lot of work in each of these work streams. We've published a lot. If you look at our posters in the City of London rooms, you'll find lists of publications by work stream. And the big focus now is actually to try to put it together and to begin to model the interdependencies. And of course, this gives us challenges in terms of visualization. If you're trying to visualize what's happening in these different dimensions with 200 countries, it's non-trivial. And so we can try and do it with maps, as with this slide. Or Elia Marchione has developed an information system where we can pick countries, sectors, we can look at the trade relationships, and we can choose from the menu of the right-hand side. So one of the things we've said we would do with this project is to build an information system which integrated our database and indeed ultimately our model outputs. And so this is the first serious shot at actually doing that. And in the remaining 18 months or so of the project, we will aim to take that further and to stitch that together in terms of this overall diagram. Well, I think that's about 23 minutes, Nigel, instead of 20, but I'll stop there, and it leaves us 5 or 7 minutes for questions. So if anybody would like to raise any questions, I'd be very happy to try to tackle them. Janos, who's always first on these occasions. I spotted him earlier and I knew he would be first.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to...
It's all right, it's all right. It's my pleasure, Janos.
It's obvious there is a profusion of models floating around, and very briefly, the question arises, whether it's trivial or otherwise, as to are there, or where are the underlying principles and some kind of a suitable symbolism, which are the two components of any kind of theory, and from these two components a new complexity science that could be constructed, which might appeal to people's intellectual taste. So the question is, again, where are the underlying principles and the corresponding symbolism that would carry these principles into a model?
Well, that's a very good question, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to respond to that. I think we have made quite a lot of progress. I mean, certainly in the work that I'm describing, and there'll be analogues in the other projects from CSRW that you hear about today, there are underlying principles. I talked about spatial interaction models. I talked about Lotka-Volterra-like models, the models that we've developed in terms of building the dynamics. Accounts for me, as in input-output accounts, accounting is a fundamental concept, I think, because it allows you to keep track of everything. And this program was originally called New Tools for Complexity Science, and I think what we're achieving between us has this kind of degree of generality. So I personally am a great believer in toolkits, and I think what will come out of CSRW and the 4 projects overall is actually a very rich toolkit. I put it that way because as a hint in the question that there might be a sort of general theory of everything. And I think my intuition is that there is too much variation across substantive domains to produce a theory of everything. I think what we can do is go into the toolkit and get relevant material, relevant tools for tackling particular problems. But I think we have to beware of going the way of general systems theory in the 1950s, where it was thought that you could actually develop a universal model. So I probably would have advocated that many years ago, but I think experience has put me into the toolkit mode. So I think we're halfway there. Please, Dougal.
I'm Gilbert. This is a question you would heard from me before. In the graph showing accurate risk against these numbers, you show a single line. How can your models incorporate uncertainty in the output and uncertainty in the input?
Well, this is why we always need you at these meetings, Dougal, as you know. I mean, you're absolutely right, and we ought to put bans on some of these things, and we ought to put systematic variations on the parameters that we're actually using. I mean, we're using best estimate parameters from data, but there's obviously a high degree of uncertainty in this. That's true both of a single time shot, which is what we have in the riots model. It's even more true if you're actually trying to forecast, because you'd expect the uncertainty bands to expand. And I think there, although it's not been illustrated today, we are beginning to be more systematic. And I've quite liked the idea, which I see now, a lot of people are using. And so it must have been timely, and a lot of people have been using before I'd got involved with it. If you think of the kind of things we used to see when people talk about hurricanes on the news, and you get the probabilistic path of a hurricane, which starts at the point where it is now, and then it diverges because of the uncertainty. And I think the challenge in trying to do that kind of forecasting is, that, if you like, it's that's a two-dimensional area of uncertainty that's expanding. I think I mentioned on one of the slides, but didn't talk about it, in talking about the complexity of this. If you're modelling retail in London, where there are 200 retail centres, you actually have 200 non-linear differential equations, and you've got a possibility cone of uncertainty in something like 200 dimensions. And so you,
back slightly on that. You cited the police chief who has to decide how many police
Yeah.
they put into the fire.
Yeah.
So if they'd had 6,000, it might have
Yeah.
lasted for a night.
Yeah.
If I was that police chief, I might multiply that by some
Yeah.
factor and say, well, the scientist is saying 6,000, I'll get 9,000 just in case.
yeah, I think I would do the same, Dougal, actually.
That's fundamental to the
Yeah.
relationship between this project and policy decisions as to how you translate the output from a model into a binary choice that the
Yeah, I agree.
decision maker has to make.
I agree.
In some way plug that gap.
I agree. I mean, it's the old engineer's safety factor, isn't it? And no, I mean, you have to be right. And so that's an important lesson probably for what all of us are talking about today, certainly for what we're talking about. Wholly accept that. Any other questions? Please.
From a pure empirical point of view, it would be much nicer if the police chief was willing to be brave, go for the 6,000 and give us another data point.
Yes. Yeah. No. Yeah. Thank you. And I have to say, I should acknowledge in that particular case the cooperation of the Met in giving us data, and indeed their ongoing interest, because we are again talking about policy applications, and both the Home Office and the Met have actually been interested in the principle of that. I think what would be even better is the police chief not putting his money on the 6,000, but having an internal team that did this not just for riots, but for other possible modelling areas in relation to crime as well, and not represented in this project, but certainly within our UCL ambit, a lot of that kind of work. Then I think there was can I jump you a minute? There was another question further back. Am I right? No, lost it. Okay, come back to the front again.
Yeah, Greg Fisher. Could I just quiz you on the model, the London riot model?
Yeah.
Did you have any factors in there where the presence of police could actually antagonise and create the problem in the first place?
No, is the short answer. And again, I think there's no, that illustrates another important principle of this kind of modelling, and it's where I fall back on the proof of concept defence, as it were, because what you do, you get to a point where you've got this kind of model, and because this wasn't actually a central part of what we were supposed to be doing on the project, we haven't continued working on it. I would actually like the police or the Home Office or others to continue working on it. But what it does, and you've just illustrated it perfectly, it opens up the next round of research. So you actually say, what are the factors we haven't got in? And that's what we should be doing indeed in all these cases.